I have cut up various carbon frames from high quality to low quality, from cheap to expensive. But what makes each frame unique? What gives each frame its characteristics, and why would you pay £4,000 for a frame when you can get a frame direct from China for around £800? To answer those questions, I've taken all the carbon fibre frames I've ever cut down to Carbon Bike Repair UK to speak to Rob, whose company has repaired over 14,000 carbon frames. So let's jump into it and see what Rob has to say.
You can see in all these brands, we've got lots of colors and we've got different makes and different shapes. But what you as the consumer don't have an understanding of necessarily is what goes into making these bikes. So the question is very valid. Why am I paying so much more for the Western bike than I am paying for the Chinese bike? Well, I've got a treat for you today, or we've got a treat for you today, because we've grabbed all of Jourdain's hard work and his chopped up bicycles, and we've brought them into one place so we can have a look and see what really is going underneath the hood of these bikes. So we've got a range of different bikes, and I'll say this on the outset, there's no brand preference here, and there's no necessarily, we don't have the luxury of having a like-for-like bicycle here, so we're going to try and just give you an indication of what's going on in a Western designed bike compared to a Chinese bike, and maybe why we think those bikes are done that way. So if we look at some of the expensive bikes like this Pinarello, for example, one of the things you'll note is all the experimentation that's taking place in the junction points, both for weight and for its characteristic, its ride characteristic. This bicycle, at the time it was designed, was arguably designed for sprinting, not climbing, although it can climb pretty well. We have a bicycle that is very purpose designed. They know why they're designing it. They know that they have to conform to the rules of the UCI particularly, and they know, most importantly, that they have to deliver a service, a warranty service, that protects this bike both on its 2-year paint warranty, if that's what that brand has got. It's generally around about 2 years, and a lifetime warranty on any particular failings of that frame set. So that's the first thing that you're paying for, is that background service that takes care of your bicycle. It's a little bit like having your own personal insurance policy on your bicycle. Whereas with a Far East frame and that you buy online, the only thing that keeps them honest is the amount of reviews that bicycle gets in terms of whether that bicycle is a bike you should think about buying or not for the money. So there's a few interesting things based on those ideas that we've come up with while we were talking off camera about why certain things are the way they are between these two bikes. So let's go through them a little bit. On the Chinese bike, and we've picked this bike here, the Trifox. One of the things we note on the Trifox, say compared to, where is this? Yeah. And bearing in mind these are very different bikes, but you get the indication of the amount of effort that's gone into, say, this canyon. You can see how incredibly thin these walls are. Now, it's not to say that the Chinese are not capable of doing this, because these bikes were made there. So it's not that they don't have the technology to do that. But you can see the wall thickness in the design of this bicycle insisted that the wall thickness was going to be like this by this German company, and that the wall thickness of the down tube was going to be almost 2 millimeters in thickness. So there's a lot of layup design work, which is the key to the bike, of how and where they want the material to be and what they want that bike to do when you ride it in such a way. So if we take this Chinese bike, I think it's Chinese, it's a Chinese Jourdain.
Yeah, the Trifox. Yeah.
Okay. And we're not picking on this company, we're just saying this is a typical example. If you see this, you see the wall thicknesses are almost the same across all the sides, which tells me that this bike company is either, there's two things. It either doesn't know what it's doing with carbon. In other words, it's taken a mold design that it likes and it's gone and put carbon in it. But they don't necessarily know what the engineering requirements are, or the dialing in of that bike for its particular characteristic. The other, a more sinister idea that I certainly think about is the fact that if this bike was made very fragile, like the Canyon is made for its purpose, The warranty claims on this bike would be huge because there are lots of issues with this bike. Bike is very fragile and it's very well cared for. Canyon customers get a very good aftercare service on their bikes, very aggressive return policy in terms of making sure the clients gets the best out of their bikes. Whereas this bike, once it's been shipped out, there's a huge distance between the manufacturer, the dealer, and the client. So the last thing they want is you to be riding a bicycle that cannot handle over clamping or bike clamp issue or chain suck issue. You're going to want a bicycle that can survive that. So the big question about all this tuning is, what do we really benefit from a bike that is well tuned and designed internally, or doesn't it matter? Now, Jordan, you rode a bike the other day where I watched your video and you said you couldn't believe how comfortable that bike was. And this was what brand was it?
Yo-Yo.
Okay.
R11 the frame was, yeah.
Yeah.
I would say they're quite big though, because they've got distributors in Europe and
right.
in the country, so they're sort of a mid-range.
And the weight of that bike?
The whole bike
was
8. It was 8 something.
Okay, I could be incorrect here, and I stand corrected. But it's generally the policy of a company that's gone to the expense of producing a bicycle with molds, etc., and all the carbon pre-orders they've got to make in order to get the prices down for the carbon. Remember, it's a supply chain. The bike you get has to go through various processes, truckloads of the stuff coming at a certain price, and the glue and the electricity bills and the factory rentals and all the things that you and I don't necessarily want to know about have an impact on the bicycle itself. Now, I propose that bike, if it was going to be shipped out to Europe, they certainly wouldn't want that bicycle to be fragile. I don't know of too many really high-end Chinese climbing bikes, for example, that are, within 5 or 6 kilograms, like I've seen, say, with the Athos or the Emonda, the Trek Emonda. I just wonder whether it's either they don't really know how to technologically build that bike, which I do find strange, or there's some other reason, and I've got a feeling it's all about warranty. A hybrid situation is probably the best. So you'd have a Chinese frame, a good quality Chinese frame, with components, Western components, would make up a really, really good bike. Yeah. But there's a distinct difference between if you want a high performance bike, you want to own a really, really good brand. You can see in the detail, if I show you, that particularly say on the Venge, the amount of work that goes on inside this bike. For example, this is all what we call tuning around the tube, or the different types of materials that they've applied, and these are all probably coming back from feedback from riders. In a certain batch, they would then add these bits in, which are not necessarily going to be there forever until they trial them for a while. So yes, although we are the bug fixers, these bikes are at a certain point where they're still very, very rideable. They would just make some changes to them. So lots of different types of carbon in specific kind of places, applying different technologies to different things, trying to make them lighter, trying to make them stiffer. And that is where the money goes. The money goes to the designers who are part of the evolution of the bicycle. I think it's very easy to copy a bicycle once somebody else has gone to the effort of understanding how to manipulate that carbon. Where you could still benefit and see the difference is in the quality of the way the carbon is woven, how you can manufacture those components together into making a very thin, stiff, light bike. And a lot of that stuff, a lot of that DNA in the bicycle is kept very much under wraps. The manufacturer themselves might not necessarily know how or why that's done that way. And that can be a protection against some of these rather interesting characteristics we have in bicycles now, where they are super, super light, very stiff, and becoming more robust.
Glasses on.
Glasses
means
on.
Business.
So this is a Chinese gravel bike. I mean, first off, I have to commend the bravery and the skills in the graphics side of the bike. It's a crystalline type material in the paint. It's a chemical reaction that makes these crystalline effects, and you see them a lot on high-end Colnagos. Very good quality. I'd say no worse than any other, because a lot of these bikes are manufactured in the Far East anyway. The supply of these materials for both our Chinese bikes locally and the international bikes, the foreign bikes, all use much the same stuff. Like, for example, these foils here. These foils are very, very difficult to get this thinness of foil here in Europe, certainly. And so you can see that they've taken advantage of all the development that our Western bikes have produced, the pressures on them to come up with solutions that they feel is acceptable for their bikes at that price point, and applying them to their Chinese bikes. So you get a lot more bang for your buck on this bike, utilizing those things on a Chinese bike. But when you flip it around, we have a look. We see a very standard layup system here. You've got a mixture of uni-weave carbon, which is carbon that is laid up in one direction. And then you've got stiffening carbon, which is what looks to me like a 3K, as that's 3,000 hairs per toe. Plane weave, which means 90-degree angles. 90-degree angle carbon is used for very stiffer shapes, whereas the twill, I don't know if you've seen them on bonnets of cars and things, where that's a kind of a step 45-degree angles, which is twill. We don't see any sign of twill here, which means that the chaps who are making this bike know that plane weave carbon is better for structural rigidity than is twill. So that's encouraging to see. I'm not seeing much evidence in wall thickness changes here, but then I'm not quite sure what the pressures are on a bike like this. It's a gravel bike, but I shouldn't think a whole lot more than a road bike. We are seeing the traditional thickening areas around the head tube, which is standard anyway. And then we're seeing some additional thicknessing here. We do see on Western bikes, we don't necessarily always see this plane weave here. I'm trying to look for an example around as I'm speaking. If you take the Giant, you'll see there's none on this side. Very little. But this can be, and I'm only hazarding a guess because I don't work for Giant, is that they use high modulus carbon. High modulus carbon is a stiffer carbon, much stronger carbon, but more brittle. So you would use high modulus carbon in more expensive bicycles because it takes a lot more energy to make a high modulus carbon, and it allows you to put less carbon in those areas so you can reduce weight. Cheaper bikes, you'd often see them with a lot more of this plane weave in them, because it's just all low modulus material, just thickening up these areas. So that's that type of development that we see coming from these brands, where they're willing to throw good carbon at the problem to make these bikes what they are. One development we've seen in carbon bikes over the last 2 to 3 years is this drive towards monocoque frames. Now you might say, yeah, but Rob, they've been making monocoque frames for years. They haven't. Monocoque is a loosely termed phrase for one piece, and it hasn't been the case for many, many years. And here's an example, and this is not just to pick on the Specialized brand, because they were all doing this. You can see what is a monocoque frame is actually a modular bike. It would be like comparing a Colnago lugged bike that's glued in on the head tube and the seat tube, except that they've hidden the lugs away. Okay, that's the difference. And here is an example of what is an overlap. So you can see that little ridge there is where this is inserted into that and then bonded with plain glue. So there is no carbon bond between these two components. If I had to heat this up, that epoxy would soften and I could pull those components apart. And back then, part of the warranty claim was if the mid-tube failed, it was normally because of the bond. Now, this is quite interesting because we just discovered this. That even on this Chinese bike, which is arguably newer, we've got less or more monocoque happening here than we have on this Specialized Venge. You can see there's no joint lines here. So basically what that means is you can see there's a wall there where a bladder would enter into the tube and come all the way around, and then they would extract that from as many places as possible to turn this into what would be a true monocoque. That is still the exception to the rule at the moment, because I think there's a lot of bikes that are still manufactured that way, where they still bond them together, and they've been all right up until now, but there's a drive to get away from the bonding aspects, because a carbon bicycle that's bonded with glue together is kind of defeats the object of the exercise. Again, I want to reiterate that we're not endorsed by Canyon at all here, but we fix a lot of their bikes. And it's interesting to note a few things. Now, if we're talking about fit for purpose, this is a really good case in point, which is why I've particularly picked this up. Also, we don't have any other frames that quite match what I want to say, so I'm using this bike. But this is a climbing bike. It's loosely modeled on the R5, the Cervelo R5, which in my opinion was just a phenomenal bike at this time, way ahead of its time. Very thin seat stays, Squirrel-like down tubes, etc., that made a very efficient climbing bike. And that shape is still being used today as a traditional climbing bike because it's very simple and efficient. This bike, what's interesting about the Canyon bike is that they're producing a price point on the Canyon bike which is phenomenal. It's very difficult to beat. They've also very aggressively sell their bikes, well, not aggressively sell their bikes, but they don't have outlets. They have test outlets where you can fit the bike, but then generally you only buy these bikes online. So that cuts a lot of costs, and they put that money into the development of the bikes. In particular, the wall thicknesses, the thinness of the bike. The designers of Canyon are very forward thinking in terms of producing a very high performance bicycle for the lowest price possible. They have run the risk of producing a bike that is known to be very fragile. It's not a robust bike like some of the other bikes we have, but then it should be said that it could be better communicated. Instead, they've got a very robust returns policy or replacement policy, which kind of meets that, because I assume it doesn't cost them as much to make the bike as maybe the others. But this is what is a typical case of fit-for-purpose bike, very simply laid up, very carefully designed. There's very little additional thinking going on in this bike. As you can see, the bottom bracket here is super simple and very cleverly designed. I'm very impressed with the Canyon, although as a fragile bike, very good for our business, particularly on the seat stays. As most people who've owned a Canyon know, at some point they've got some problems with chain suck. But yeah, a very transparent, fit-for-purpose bicycle that we get typically out of the knowledge that we have here in the West.
If you enjoyed this video, then you will enjoy this video as well, where I ask Rob 12 of the most common questions about carbon fibre. Very insightful knowledge from Rob. There will be links to Rob's company, Carbon Bike Repair UK, in the description down below.